Baek Jun-yuk was still speaking when his knees hit the floor. Not from a blow, not from a weapon. From 12 words delivered in flawless Korean by the woman he had spent the last 3 minutes publicly dismissing as furniture. Sophia D. Monroe stood over him in red silk, unhurried, unblinking, her champagne glass still held with perfect steadiness in one hand, and let the silence that followed do what silence does best. The ballroom's 400 guests did not move. Crystal did not clink. Music did not play. There was only the soft sound of a powerful man understanding, too late, the magnitude of his miscalculation. She had named his accounts, his shell companies, his buried transactions across 11 countries, spoken aloud in sequence with the casual precision of someone reading a grocery list. Except every item on the list was a crime, and every person in the room had just become a witness. Across the ballroom, Yoon Tae-gyum stood with a whiskey glass arrested halfway to his lips and an expression his lieutenants had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not calculation, recognition of a woman he had lived beside for 2.5 years without ever actually seeing. She had never spoken Korean, not once, not at board dinners or clan meetings, not in the long silences of their shared penthouse, not in any of the thousands of hours they had occupied the same world while remaining strangers inside it. He had married her for what she appeared to be, composed, decorative, safely foreign, and she had let him believe it. The question that detonated in his chest as Baek Jun-yuk knelt shaking on the ballroom floor was not, "Who is this woman?" It was, "How long has she known everything?" Before we go any further into Sophia's world, I want to pause here with you for just a moment. You chose this story out of everything you could have been watching right now, and that means something to me. Drop a comment and tell me your name, or where you're watching from, even just a city, a country, a time zone. I write these stories for real people, and I want to know you're out there. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the woman no one saw coming. Before Korea, Sophia Monroe had a different kind of power. For 8 years, she worked inside a world most people didn't know existed. A forensic financial intelligence unit operating across 4 continents, quiet as a blade and twice as sharp. She didn't carry weapons. She didn't need them. She followed money the way a surgeon follows a vein, precisely, patiently, with the understanding that what you find at the end of the trail is always worse than what anyone wanted to admit. She dismantled 3 cartels, 2 government ministries, and 1 private bank that had laundered its way through the better part of a decade. She was very good at her job. That was, in the end, the problem. The Meridian case should have been her finest work. A senator-adjacent crime network threaded through 17 shell companies across 8 countries, elegant in its construction and catastrophic in its reach. She found the architecture. She documented everything. She filed the report through every proper channel available to her, and then she waited. The report disappeared in 4 days. Her security clearance followed in 2 weeks. By the end of the month, her career had been quietly erased, discredited, restructured, reduced to a name on a termination notice that cited performance concerns nobody had ever raised before. And then the other things started. The car that followed her home, the door that had been opened and carefully closed again, the message, never written down, that reached her through a friend of a colleague of someone she'd once trusted. Leave, or don't leave at all. She left. A contact led to a lawyer. The lawyer led to a name. The name, Yoon Tae-gyum, led to a conversation conducted entirely in formal English across a conference table in a neutral city with paperwork already prepared on both sides. He needed political cover. A Western wife with a clean background created a specific kind of legitimacy that certain alliances required. She needed a country where the people who wanted her dead would not think to look. The terms were clean, simple, and entirely without warmth. They signed the same afternoon. Somewhere over the Pacific, 30,000 feet above a world that had just rearranged itself entirely around her, Sophia Monroe made herself one promise. She would never stop watching. She kept it. She learned Korean in 31 days. Not conversational Korean, not tourist phrases or polite greetings. She learned it the way she had learned everything that mattered in her life, completely, structurally, from the root up, until she could follow a negotiation conducted in rapid Seoul dialect across a crowded dining room and catch every implication underneath the words. She studied between midnight and 4 in the morning, when the penthouse was quiet and Taegyam was wherever Taegyam went in the dark hours. She used materials she ordered under a secondary email address and deleted her search history with the automatic thoroughness of someone who had spent 8 years understanding exactly how trails were found. By the 6th month, she had mapped every significant player in the Yoon clan's inner structure. Names, roles, the precise texture of their loyalty, which was absolute, which was transactional, which was the kind that would fracture under the right pressure at the right moment. She noted it all. She cross-referenced what she heard in rooms she wasn't supposed to understand against financial patterns she tracked through the business press and the clan's visible holdings. A picture emerged, slow and detailed, the way pictures always did when you had the patience to let them develop. She kept 2 notebooks, encrypted and physically hidden in separate locations. One tracked people, one tracked money. Together they formed a portrait of Seoul's criminal architecture more comprehensive than anything the city's law enforcement had ever assembled. She knew this because she understood, from professional experience, exactly what institutional intelligence gathering looked like and where it consistently failed to look. She attended every gala, every dinner, every function Taegyam required her presence for. She wore what was expected. She smiled when smiled at. She occupied the background the way beautiful, silent things are expected to occupy it, without demand, without opinion, without apparent awareness. The men in those rooms spoke freely around her. They always did. Women who didn't speak Korean were furniture, and furniture didn't need to be managed. She let them believe it. She was careful. She was consistent. She was patient in the way that only someone who has survived the alternative truly understands how to be. And somewhere beneath the patience, beneath the discipline, beneath the careful architecture of 2.5 years of invisible work, something waited. A reason. He found her where he always found her at this hour. The city was still gray with early light, Seoul assembling itself slowly below the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Sophia stood at the glass with a coffee cup held in both hands and her back to the room. She hadn't slept. He could tell from the particular quality of her stillness, not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of someone who had been very still for a very long time and had simply continued. He poured his own coffee. He crossed the room. He stood beside her, and for a moment neither of them acknowledged the other, which was, he realized, exactly how every morning of the past 2.5 years had begun. "How long," he said quietly, "have you spoken Korean?" A beat. Outside, a light changed on the bridge below. "Since the 5th week of our marriage." He absorbed this the way he absorbed most things that mattered, without visible reaction, while something shifted completely beneath the surface. He turned to look at her. She was still watching the city. "Tell me who you are," he said. Not a demand, something closer to a request, which was not a register his voice used often. So she told him. The unit, the 8 years, the Meridian case, the senator's network, the report that vanished and the career that followed it. The 4 days between filing her findings and understanding that the people she had reported to were connected to the people she had reported on. The car outside her apartment. The decision made in a single night to disappear before someone made it permanent. She told him about the lawyer, the arrangement, the conference table in the neutral city, and the promise she had made herself somewhere over the Pacific that she intended to keep. She told him why she had finally spoken at the gala. Because Baek Jun-hyuk had placed his hand on her as though she was inventory. Because she had watched him dismantle Taegyam's alliances for 8 months and had 2.5 years of documentation ready to respond with. Because silence, she said quietly, had always been a choice, not a limitation. Taegyam was quiet for a long time after she finished. "We've been strangers," he said finally. "Yes. I'd like to stop." Sophia looked at him then, directly, without the careful blankness she had worn in every room for 2.5 years. What she offered instead was not warmth exactly, but honesty, which in that moment cost her considerably more. "So would I." The council met in a room that had no windows and did not appear on any building schematic Sophia had ever located. 7 men around a black lacquered table, each of them responsible for a different axis of the Yoon clan's operations, each of them looking at her with a variation of the same expression, polite, guarded, and unconvinced. She had expected that. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything. She opened the dossier without preamble. The skepticism in the room was immediate and not particularly subtle. 2 of the 7 did not look at the documents she placed in front of them. One addressed a quiet remark to the man beside him, in Korean naturally, suggesting that the boss's wife presenting intelligence to the inner council was an indulgence they could afford to humor briefly before returning to business that mattered. Sophia heard every word. She did not acknowledge it. She moved to the first page. "Baek Jun-hyuk's primary holdings," she said, in Korean that carried no hesitation and no accent, "are structured across 4 jurisdictions through a network of 19 shell companies. The outermost layer is clean. The second layer, less so." She set down a document. "By the 3rd layer, you find the accounts that paid for the 3 supplier contracts he acquired from you in the past 11 months. I've traced the capital origin for each one." She walked them through it methodically, the way she had always worked, not with drama, but with sequence. One thread leading to the next, each revelation placed carefully before the previous one had fully settled, building a structure of evidence so internally consistent that dismantling any single piece of it would require dismantling all the others simultaneously. By the 4th page, both men who had ignored the documents were reading them. By the 7th, no one in the room was speaking. She saved the final section for last. 18 months of documented financial surveillance, cross-referenced and time-stamped, that mapped the precise mechanism by which Baek Jun-hyuk had been quietly bankrupting the clan's eastern operations while presenting himself as a neutral party at every table. She closed the folder. The silence that followed was a different quality than the silence at the beginning. She recognized it. She had produced it before, in other rooms, on other continents, in a life that had been taken from her by men who had made the same mistake Baek Jun-hyuk had made at the gala. They had assumed she wasn't dangerous. At the head of the table, Taegyam watched his counsel look at his wife the way men look at something they have only just understood, with the careful, recalibrated attention of people who will not make the same error twice. She had known retaliation was coming. She had known its approximate shape, its likely timing, and the specific logic a man like Bae Jun-hyuk would apply when choosing how to respond to public humiliation from someone he had already decided to underestimate. Cornered men with resources and wounded pride do not wait. They recalibrate, quickly, toward the target that costs the least to hit and sends the clearest message. She had been preparing for it since the morning after the gala. It came on a Tuesday, in the 15 minutes between her leaving the Yoon clan's financial attorney and reaching the car that was waiting for her. A side street, deliberately chosen. 2 men she didn't recognize and one she did, a former Bay lieutenant she had flagged in her second notebook 8 months ago, beside a note that read, "Will follow orders past the point most men stop." She had taken a different exit from the building than the one she had used on every previous visit. She had noted the car parked at the wrong angle 40 meters up the street. She had already placed the call before they moved. It lasted less than 4 minutes. She was unhurt. The men were not. She was standing on the pavement with her phone in her hand and her pulse at a level she considered professionally acceptable when the second car arrived. Taegyam's, moving too fast, stopping at an angle that suggested the driver had been told to get there and had taken that instruction literally. Taegyam was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. He crossed the distance between them and said nothing. He took her face in both hands, turning it slightly, reading her for damage with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled severity of a man managing a situation, but something rawer than that. Something that had arrived before his composure could organize itself around it. "I'm not hurt," she said. He didn't release her. His hands were not entirely steady. She understood in that moment that something had shifted in him that would not shift back. Taegyam had spent his entire adult life constructing a self that did not require anyone's survival but his own. That architecture, she could see, had just developed a flaw he hadn't anticipated and didn't yet know how to address. He cared whether she lived. It was, for a man like him, very close to catastrophic. In the 3 days following the ambush, Sophia produced more work than she had in the previous 2 weeks combined. She updated both notebooks. She refined her financial model of Bok Joon-hyuk's remaining assets, identifying the sequence in which they would need to be unwound to cause maximum structural damage with minimum recoverable margin. She drafted a secondary contingency for the summit, a tertiary for the scenario in which he moved against the clan's eastern operations before she was ready. She slept 4 hours a night and did not mention this to anyone. She was precise, thorough, and completely unreachable in the way that has nothing to do with location and everything to do with where a person has chosen to put themselves. Taegyam watched her do it for 3 days before he came to find her. She was at the desk in the study, past midnight, when he set a cup of coffee beside her and did not leave. She thanked him without looking up. He sat down in the chair across the room and remained there in silence until the silence itself became a presence she couldn't analytically process her way around. "Sophia," his voice was quiet, "stop working." "I'm almost finished with the—" "Stop working." She stopped. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that had shed every layer of the careful construction she had spent 2.5 years observing, the authority, the distance, the impenetrable composure that ran the Yoon clan's empire and never let anything through. What remained underneath was not comfortable for either of them. "When they moved toward you," he said, "and I did not yet know if you were—" He paused, began again. "I have made decisions that ended lives. I have done it without feeling anything I would describe as significant. I built an entire system around myself, specifically so that nothing could matter enough to become a liability." He looked at her steadily. "You have become something I have no framework for, and I need you to know that, because I think you are in that room right now to avoid knowing it." The silence that followed was long. Sophia set down her pen. Something moved across her face, not the controlled blankness, not the professional composure, but something underneath both of those, something that had been waiting behind 2.5 years of careful invisibility for someone to simply tell her the truth first. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally. "Any of this." "Neither do I," said Taegyam. "I thought we might try anyway." The annual investment summit occupied the top 3 floors of Seoul's most expensive hotel and drew, every year, the precise category of powerful men who understood that the distance between legitimate finance and criminal enterprise was largely a matter of documentation. Sophia had attended twice before as a background presence. She attended this year as something else entirely. She wore black. She had considered this carefully. The work itself had been finished 4 days prior, 3 months of methodical, layered dismantling, supplier relationships severed through legitimate contractual mechanisms she had identified in Baek Jun-yak's own paperwork, offshore accounts reported to the specific regulatory bodies most likely to move quickly and least likely to be managed from the inside. Evidence packagers assembled with the precise formatting and sourcing she knew from professional experience made things impossible to quietly bury. She had done it in the correct sequence, which mattered. Pull the wrong thread first, and the structure collapses inward. Pull them in order, and it collapses outward, publicly, with nowhere for the person at the center to go. She had pulled them in order. Baek Jun-yak arrived at the summit at 9:17. She noted the exact moment he understood because it moved across his face in a specific progression she had seen before. Confusion first, then the rapid reassessment, then the particular gray quality that arrives when a man reaches for the resources he has spent years accumulating and finds the space where they were entirely empty. His lead financial contact would not meet his eyes. The 2 suppliers he had positioned on the eastern side of the room had already left. When he reached for his phone, whatever he found there completed something in his expression that did not recover. He looked up once, scanning the room, and found her. Sophia held his gaze with the same composure she had held every room in for 2.5 years, still, unhurried, giving nothing away. She did not smile. She did not need to. Beside her, she felt Tae-gyum's hand settle at the small of her back. A quiet thing. A present tense thing. The authorities arrived at 9:41. Clean ones. Tae-gyum had spent 6 weeks on that specific detail because she had asked him to and explained precisely why it mattered. The room watched Baek Jun-yak leave in a way he had not planned to leave. And in the murmuring that followed, in the careful recalibration of 400 powerful people reassessing everything they thought they knew about the Yoon clan's position in this city, Sophia heard the sound she recognized from 8 years of this work. The sound of a structure that would not be rebuilt. The world, it turned out, looked different when you stopped pretending not to understand it. 1 month after the summit, Sophia moved through the Yoon clan's ecosystem the way water moves through a landscape it has already mapped, finding every channel with the ease of something that has always known exactly where it belongs. The inner council had stopped performing their skepticism. There was no percentage in it anymore, and these were pragmatic men. They brought her problems now the way they had once only brought them to Tae-gyum. Supply chain vulnerabilities, contractual disputes, the occasional alliance that required more careful reading than it initially presented. She addressed each one in the language most efficient for the purpose. Korean for the council, Japanese for the Osaka contacts they were quietly rebuilding through cleaner channels, the precise, formal financial English that made certain categories of men instantly understand they were not the most technically capable person in the room. She had always been capable of this. The difference was simply that she had stopped making herself smaller than it. The dinner was at home. No staff, no occasion. The kind of evening that had become possible in the past month in the way that small, ordinary things become possible when 2 people stop maintaining careful distance from each other. Tae-gyum cooked, which she had not known he could do until 3 weeks ago, and which he did with the same focused economy he applied to everything that mattered to him. They were finishing the last of the wine when he set something on the table between them. A ring. Simple, precise, significant in the way of things chosen with full knowledge of the person they are intended for. He did not reach for it. He left it there, between them, and looked at her with the particular directness he had only learned to offer her recently. No construction around it, no management of what it might reveal. "I want to dissolve the arrangement," he said. "I want to replace it with something we choose, knowing everything, with nothing between us that either of us has not already seen." A pause. "I would like you to choose me back, Sophia. Not because the terms require it, because you want to." The city moved quietly outside the windows. Sophia looked at the ring, then at the man across the table who had sat in a hallway of her silence for 2.5 years without ever quite giving up on what might be behind it. She reached across the table. She chose him. The wedding was 12 people, and no performance. They had discussed something larger. The council had opinions, as councils do, about the symbolic value of a formal ceremony for the Yun clan's leadership. Sophia had listened to all of it, considered it with the same methodical attention she gave everything, and then told Tae-gyum quietly that she had spent 2.5 years being a symbol and would prefer, this time, to simply be a person. He had agreed without deliberation, which was, she reflected, one of the things she had come to understand about him. He was decisive about the things that mattered and entirely uninterested in the things that didn't. She wore red silk. This had been deliberate. The ceremony was conducted in Korean, which she followed without effort, in a room that held only the people they had each, in their separate and guarded ways, decided to trust. Tae-gyum held both her hands and said the words with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things he intended to be permanent. She said hers back clearly, without hesitation, in the language she had learned in 31 days in the first month of a marriage that had been, until recently, about survival. This one was about something else. A year after that, Seoul was still gray with early light when she came to stand at the window. The city assembled itself below in the particular unhurried way of early mornings, bridges and rooftops and the slow brightening of water. And Sophia stood at the glass with coffee held in both hands and felt the quality of the silence around her, which was different now from every silence that had come before it. Not the silence of concealment, not the silence of a woman making herself invisible in a world she wasn't supposed to understand. Just the ordinary, inhabitable quiet of a morning in a place she had chosen. She heard him before she felt him. The specific sound of Tae-gyum moving through a room, unhurried, certain of his welcome. His arms came around her from behind, his chin at her temple, both of them watching the city wake below. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Sophia considered the question honestly, the way she had, slowly, imperfectly, learned to consider everything that mattered. "That I'm here," she said. "That I chose it. That it's enough." Outside, the light continued to come. And that's where we leave Sophia. Not running, not hiding, just standing at a window in a city she chose, held by a man who chose her back. If something in this story stayed with you, if you recognized something in her silence or her armor or the moment she finally let herself be known, tell me about it in the comments. I read everything, and sometimes what you write back is the reason the next story gets told. Subscribe if you want to be there when it does. The next woman with a secret is already waiting, and something tells me her silence is even more dangerous than Sophia's.